This lecture is going to be pretty short. It's going to be on something called the species problem. We will get to what exactly the species problem is in just a moment. Before we do that, though, I just want to talk a little bit about modern evolutionary theory. We've spent a lot of time talking about the progression of evolutionary theory from a historical standpoint. So I just wanted to talk briefly about evolutionary theory as it's studied today. So as it says here, evolutionary biologists can study either microevolution or macroevolution. Microevolution is basically studying the small-scale changes in a species, such as the changes in allele frequencies. Geneticists do a lot of this type of work, and this is not something that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. Macroevolution, on the other hand, are long-term effects through time and changes produced only after many generations. So we're talking about the long-term cumulative effect of all of these smaller scale changes that you might be studying with microevolution. So what we're going to be talking about here in terms of macroevolution is something called speciation. So speciation is basically how we identify species, how we observe them over time evolving, the origin of new species, all of that kind of stuff is what we're going to be covering with this section. So speciation, the study of speciation begins with three basic questions. First, are species real? This might seem like kind of a strange question, but basically what we're asking here is whether species exist in nature as a biological entity, whether there are actual categories of animals that exist objectively in nature outside of the human experience, or if they're just something that humans have designated as a way of making our environment easier to understand, kind of a way of categorizing our environment and making things nice and neat and orderly. Our brains are kind of geared towards wanting to recognize patterns. So the question is, do species exist in nature? Do these entities exist in nature, or are these just categories that we have kind of arbitrarily decided that exist that don't have any real bearing in nature? So that's the first question. If we were to agree that species are in fact real, the next question is, what are they? How do we define them? We'll get more to this question in just a moment. But the last one, why do they exist? What natural processes are leading to species existing? So these are some of the questions that we will be talking about here. Now, the first question, are species real? Darwin himself wrote a little bit about. I won't read this quote to you. You can read it on your own time. But basically, Darwin had his doubts. So Darwin speculated in some of his writings that the concept of a species is one that is kind of arbitrarily given, as we see here, for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals that closely resemble each other. So he thought that species were something that were in large part categories of animals that were created by humans for the sense of convenience. So how do biologists define species? Before we get to that, this idea of a species concept is something that hopefully you'll be reading about and that we'll be talking about for the next few slides here. A species concept is basically how you define a species. What kind of characteristics are you using in your definition? A very kind of oversimplified way of approaching this question would be if you had a child who was maybe, 5 years old, who had never heard the term species before, how would you explain the concept of a species to that child? What kinds of characteristics would you talk about? Would you say, oh, it's a group of animals that all look alike, it's a group of animals that all behave alike? What are the criteria that you would use to describe a species? There are actually lots of different ways that you can describe species. So there are lots of different species concepts, one of which is listed here on the slide, which is called the biological species concept. So the biological species concept is defined as species being groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So what this just means is that the biological species concept defines species as being animals basically that can interbreed and produce viable offspring with each other. So a dog and a cat are not the same species because a dog and a cat cannot mate and produce offspring. A Chihuahua and a Great Dane, even though they look very dissimilar, are genetically capable of interbreeding and producing offspring, so they are technically the same species. So the biological species concept is a really easy to use, clear-cut, seemingly kind of clear-cut and simple way of defining species. But as lots of researchers have pointed out, the biological species concept can be problematic. So there are some very valid criticisms of the biological species concept. The first here is hybridization. So hybridization would be cross-species breeding events where you have hybrids or crossed individuals that are produced as a result of that interbreeding event. Hybridization takes place in nature very frequently. It takes place in nature pretty frequently in animals and all the time in plants. So it's something that is kind of a confounding variable for the biological species concept. An example of hybridization would be it's a pretty widely held opinion that wolves and coyotes are different species. But wolves and coyotes can mate with each other and produce completely viable offspring. Same goes for dogs and wolves and coyotes and dogs, etc., etc. There's a lot of potential for hybridization there. The second item, asexually reproducing species. What this means is species that reproduce asexually, meaning there is no sexual reproduction. So if you're depending upon the ability to interbreed as part of your definition, you really can't apply that to any asexually reproducing species. And there are lots of asexually reproducing species in nature. Basically, these are cases in which you have offspring that are arising from a single organism. This is how many microorganisms reproduce. A lot of plants and fungi reproduce this way, but there are some animals that reproduce this way as well. There have been some kind of weird cases where hammerhead sharks, for example, have been documented to be capable of asexual reproduction. So again, if you're looking at interbreeding, the ability to interbreed, that really doesn't apply in any way to an asexually reproducing species. The last item here, paleospecies. The biological species concept requires that we know whether two groups can interbreed and produce viable offspring. Paleontologists don't have any way of knowing whether two fossil species could have interbred. Even if they lived contemporaneously with each other, we have no way of knowing whether they were interbreeding. So the biological species concept can be useful, but it's pretty problematic in a lot of areas of study.